welcome. Thank you so much for joining us today. I'm Kate Middleton and I'm here with my co-host Justin Humphreys. Hello, Justin.
Morning, Kate. Well, I'd like to say that it's a glorious day here, but it's not so much. It's a little bit overcast. But hey, I'm so looking forward to our conversation today with Roger. So I'm all geared up and ready to go.
Great, Justin. I don't think you can complain because I've seen your social media and you've just come back from the Lake District and the sun shone.
I know.
That never happens when I go to the Lake District. I cannot tell you how many photos I have of beautiful Lake District views shrouded in the mist.
Yeah, but isn't that beautiful? So,
Well,
I think I probably
could try and convince my kids of that, but I haven't won them over yet. Yours looked prettier than mine, but I'm glad you had a good time.
Great time.
Anyway, we're not here alone before we wander into holiday comparison stories. We are joined today by someone who's been both a good friend and a source of wisdom over many years. Good morning, Roger Bretherton.
Hello, Kate. Hello, Justin. Lovely to be joining you.
Thank you so much for taking some time to chat with us today. Roger is a clinical psychologist. For those who haven't come across him before, he has an expertise and long-term studying of character, a significant research background as a psychologist, but also as a theologian, a particular interest also in working with leaders across many spheres. Isn't that right, Roger?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, right across everything, really, including many church leaders as well. In fact, one of my doctoral students at the University of Lincoln, just in the last couple of years, has published a series of papers on clergy and church leader well-being. And one of them was called Jesus Got Crucified, So Why Shouldn't We? Which sort of just kind of gives you this idea of what some church leaders expect their leadership to be like.
Yeah, that's a little catchy little title there. I think what's going to be so fascinating chatting to you is that overlap, that you have an expertise in leadership and also a particular interest in the character of leadership and the character qualities that are important for leadership and healthy leadership, which I'm sure we'll define and discuss a bit in a minute. But particularly your knowledge then as well of church context and the comparison of the two, I think, is really fascinating. So perhaps we should kick off with that, Roger. And I'm intrigued in your experience, and as we start talking about church leadership, are there ways in which you feel that is a different context from other forms of leadership? And if so, tell us a bit about why you think church leadership is different.
I think that there are quite a few differences. So there's sort of positives and negatives to it. So I think, if we jump into the immediate thing that comes to mind for me is that there aren't many forms of leadership where your identity so entirely overlaps with your work as it does in church leadership. So I even meet sort of very, very high level leaders, let's say in banking and other fields like that, where, their leadership takes over their whole life. They're working 24/7 and all that kind of stuff, but they still have quite a strong differentiation between what their private life is and what their kind of public service life is. So they know when they're working and when they're not. Whereas when I speak to a lot of church leaders, it's really, really difficult to sort of differentiate between, what's your personal life, what's your vocation, when are you working. It makes it very hard to set boundaries on the kind of demands that people make of you in that sort of position. I hear some church leaders say things like, Jesus never had a day off being Jesus, so how can I have a day off being a Christian? And so I think that's one of the things. I think the other side of it is that there's a strong sense of calling in church leadership that isn't necessarily always the case in sort of, for want of a better word, more secular kind of leadership roles. And what I mean by that is you'll encounter some church contexts, particularly sort of the Anglican Church or some of the more established denominations, where it's almost the idea that God only ever speaks once, and he speaks to tell people to become vicars, and that's the call. And once you've had the call, you're sort of almost ontologically distinct from other human beings, and you have to behave in a different way and embody yourself in a different way. And it means, therefore, that you're exposed to not just the positive elements of vocation. So the positive element of vocation is you have a gift, a contribution you want to give to the world, and you find a context in which you do it. The negative piece of vocation is that it can lead to workaholism. So you end up working too hard, not being able to give up on it. It can lead to a kind of a passion that's a bit obsessive. So lots and lots of other things suffer as a result of you sort of pursuing this single goal. So, I have met church leaders, sadly, who've said to me, we know now that our kids have grown up that we sacrificed them on the altar of church leadership. This sort of idea, this is the thing we were pursuing, and everything else sort of fell apart. And we now look back and realize that was a bit of a mistake on our part. And then just finally, the other sort of dark side of vocation is that we tend to be idealized by the people that we lead. So very often people will be looking to church leaders to be special, to be exceptional. And almost none of us as human beings can escape the trap. If people want to treat us as special and exceptional, we quite like that and we want to live up to it. But it leads to all kinds of problems down the line when we disappoint people, don't deliver, can't be what they need us to be, because ultimately, none of us can be that. So just off the top of my head, there are a couple of the things that make me think that sort of being a church leader can be a really, really different kind of, can we even call it a job? It's definitely a different kind of occupational vocation than other things.
Yeah, that's interesting. It strikes me as you've talked about quite a few things that are implications for health in terms of our personal health as leaders, maybe even implications for the health of our family. So workaholism, the sort of obsessive nature of the way that we work, struggling to lay down good boundaries and things. But I wonder, out of all of that, do you think there's implications for how we need to think about healthy leadership in our impact on others in terms of those we lead?
Yeah, well, ultimately, leadership is a sort of form of modelling. This is one of the sort of when you look at the sort of leadership literature more broadly, there's been a real interesting shift over the last decade or so, really, to studying followership as well as leadership, because sort of beginning to realise that how you follow others is also then the way you lead later. So what happens is if you're leading a system in a particular way, you are inducting and entraining that system to be a bit like you on some level. The sort of negative examples might be things like if you are a very highly achievement-based leader, so you have some church leaders where numbers is everything. How many, bumps on seats you get on a Sunday is the thing that really, really matters. And what that means is it then it trains you as a leader. It also trains your entire congregation to pay attention to the people that are most likely to lead to an increase in numbers and to ignore those who won't, which means that quite often your church will tend towards celebrating the more high status people in the room and ignoring some of the lower status people. Or if it does pay attention to them, they're sort of viewed as like charity cases for a different ministry that isn't really the central mission of the church. It's something we do on the side somewhere else. So that can happen. The more positive element of it, though, is that if you have a leader who's, yes, persistent and visionary, but also quite humble, you'll tend to find that will ripple through the church as well. So if you have truly godly leaders, they train their church to be that way as well. And that can look really beautiful and really wonderful. And what I've noticed in systems like that, both in church and outside of church, is that if you have people who are really good followers, I can think of my I won't name him, but my current church leader, actually, before he led with his wife, the church I'm part of, was a sort of leader in the NHS. And he was part of a team that was really dysfunctional, but he just got on with the job. And then when he became the leader of that team, weirdly, lots of the dysfunction in the team disappeared because everybody started to follow him in the way that he had followed the previous leader. So the way he followed became the model of the way he led, and the whole team fell into line like that. And you can see something pretty similar in churches, that ultimately, I see some leaders who are constantly accusing other people of creating power struggles or whatever, but usually it's because that's the way they operate and everybody's just imitating the way they do things. So it's both good and bad, that sort of modelling element of things.
I love all that because it's about intentionality to a degree, isn't it? We reap what we sow. And if we sow good things, we would hope that good things return. The whole concept of what it means to model healthy behaviours, attitudes, creating those environments that have those things as part of their DNA, I think is so important. And I think it's good for us to remind ourselves that those environments and those behaviours don't happen by accident. We have to be quite deliberate about pursuing them, practicing them, getting into the discipline of them ourselves, and ensuring that they're an accurate reflection of who we are as individuals, don't we? This is both an individual element, but also a corporate collective element that's so important to all of that.
It's interesting though, isn't it? Because I think that element of intentionality sort of assumes quite a high level of self-awareness though, doesn't it? And what you were saying, Roger, about the overlap with identity in church leadership, in Christian leadership perhaps particularly, if you're not, it strikes me from what you're saying there, Roger, if you're not aware of your own culture, then you might influence your church culture without really realizing that that's what you're doing. And it sounded like there was an element of that in some of the stories that you told, perhaps.
Yeah, I think that's right. And the thing for me that sort of connects the sort of individual to the corporate in these sense, it is that what happens is that the way that we relate to people becomes the fractal pattern that then repeats itself through every level of whatever organisation we're at the centre of. And that's why, so for example, I encounter some churches where the sort of dualism that runs through every level of the church would be performer and audience. There's always someone who's performing and an adoring audience who surround them. And then what that means is at every level that's then repeated right down to the very bottom. Even the way people disciple one another, you have the sort of adoring disciple who meets you in Starbucks while the discipler sort of acts like they're the performer who's now telling you what to do. And you see that sort of repeated all the way through. You see the same things with control. You see the same things with leaders who need a lot of emotional holding and attention. You see that the same thing with leaders who are very sort of task-driven or numbers-orientated, that these things sort of fractally spin out. Now, the difficulty with self-awareness, I think, for church leaders particularly, more than almost anyone, it is that there is a lot of pressure on them from their system to be perfect, really. And I sometimes feel a bit sorry for church leaders that they can't do... It's very difficult for them to do the kind of development that someone like me is able to do, because I'm not leading a big system like that. I don't have people looking to me to be perfect, and therefore I've been able to have loads of therapy and really think things and change my mind about stuff. And what that means is if you go into church leadership, particularly if you're quite young when you go into it, and by young I mean kind of 20s, 30s, it's really, really difficult for you to grow in the role. Because you're constantly under pressure to remain and be this person that you were when you first arrived. And that, to me, speaks to some of the sort of deconstruction that we see of some church leaders, where they sort of very, very achievement-based to begin with, and then gradually, as they start to doubt or wonder about that, rather than that becoming a point of maturity that they can step into, it's kind of viewed as a failure, or I don't have the passion I once had. Whereas actually, my understanding of it is actually that's the natural spiritual journey. We start off thinking we can do stuff for God, and then as we mature, we realise that actually there's a lot in us that actually hinders God from ever using us. And we work through some of that stuff, and it feels pretty tough. But then as we come out the other side of that, it means that we enter into a period of life where we're no longer preoccupied with ourselves. We can get over ourselves, and we can genuinely be loving, serving, those kind of things. Our egos have been reduced slightly. And I think for some church leaders, it's really, really hard for them to take that journey, because the entire system sort of prevents them from taking the sort of downside, the slightly unsuccessful element of that.
That's a really interesting question, isn't it? The one of whether it's possible to change from inside that quite complex and quite powerful system, as you say, with followers who are bought into perhaps a pattern, a character, a culture, and a leader who perhaps, as you say, was almost selected for the fact they fitted into that culture. When we talk, it's interesting. There's a whole other conversation really about unpicking what we recognize as calling, how we identify leaders. I'm interested, your story of one of the stories you just told of change was a different leader coming in. and therefore a culture changed when the leader changed. I wonder how much possibility there is for change in the midst of that quite intricate, quite complex, and perhaps quite rigid culture. If a leader is thinking, well, actually I'm not happy with this, or maybe there are other people in that culture. I know one thing that Justin and I talk a lot about is challenge. How do you challenge people when you know something unhealthy is happening? Is that actually possible, or does there need to be a change of leadership in order to bring about change of culture?
I think these are really important things for us to think about, aren't they? Roger, I'm sure you've got plenty to say on that. It strikes me that there is a bit of a resistance often to integrating thoughts or even individuals and maybe leaders from outside into our contexts, and we sometimes have a sense of we understand ourselves better than anybody. We don't need anybody from outside, and least of all do we need people, let's say, from a secular environment coming in and telling us how the church should operate. What do you see of those sorts of things in the work that you're doing?
Yeah, so I noticed that I sort of carry this interesting thing of having a foot in both worlds, really. So I have a foot in an academic world that, certainly some of the contexts I've worked in are quite hostile to faith, really. Hostile maybe is the wrong word, sort of indifferent maybe is perhaps better, like aren't interested in the sort of church. And then a foot in a church world that I love and I understand and on the whole is very life-giving to me, but which doesn't necessarily want to be told, from a psychologist exactly what to do. And the dilemma for me as a psychologist is that often I want to be a critical friend to church, really, and church actually really just wants a pet. Wants me to come in and kind of just affirm everything they're doing as wonderful and fantastic and the best stuff in the world. And I think what I find hard about some church cultures, this is not all at all by any means, is that some church cultures have this idea that they are this kind of Edenic, perfect environment, far better than anything out there that you can encounter. But when I walk into it and encounter it, I find that not to be the case, that's a kind of deluded belief they hold about themselves, which then prevents, when we start talking about toxic leadership or we talk about spiritual abuse issues and things like that, it prevents anybody from ever being able to bring those things up because they're like, but this is the perfect environment, those things just can't happen there. And then they turn to all the kinds of defenses that people turn to if they're protecting their own specialness, which are shooting the messenger, blaming the victim, denial, bringing in people to sort of strong arm the situation, trying to control the narrative, so all those kind of defenses kick in, and it's all a way of defending this idea that we are this perfect environment, far better than anything that's out there, and therefore we need to defend that view of things because we've somehow lost our distinctiveness in God if we lose those things.
Yeah, what are your thoughts then, bearing in mind all of this? There has been quite a powerful trend in certainly the last decade or so to apply secular leadership models very much to church leadership, to hone and form and train young leaders, but also leaders who are more senior in some of the classic secular leadership sort of patterns. I mean, do you think that that's sensible? Is it wise? Is it something that we should do with caution? Or do you think that there are risks of doing that, bearing in mind just how different it is?
It's also, so I see the good and bad in that. So you have to remember that when you look at the actual research literature on leadership, firstly, no one can define what a leader is. So you go to any academic conference and stand up and say, a leader is this. You'll have 5 hands in the air saying, but what about that? Isn't it this? What about the other? So firstly, it's not like the secular leadership discipline is one thing. Like I think I was reading a piece the other day, I think that had something like 100 different definitions of leadership and was looking about how those had changed over the decades from the 1960s through to today. Like every decade, there's new paradigms of leadership coming up. Where I think it's unhelpful, it is that I think approaches that draw on sort of, and unfortunately church does do this a lot, sometimes it's sort of a few decades behind the cutting edge of where leadership science is at any given moment. And so particularly if you draw on sort of models of leadership based on the 1980s, early 90s, you end up with very sort of powerful, heroic, transformational sort of versions of leader, where the leader is this sort of heroic figure who sort of strides through the church and through the world and is always in control and knows what everything's about. That sort of does sometimes lead towards a bit of misogyny. It leads to this idea of the sort of the adored pastor at the centre of the adoring congregation, the adored father at the centre of the family. And I do think that tends to be quite disastrous because it prevents any self-awareness from going on, because the aim of the leader in those contexts is always just to be in control. I was hearing, someone was telling me a story just the other day about a really, really famous leader who sadly has now fallen from grace. So I can't name any names in this, but you would know who I was talking about if I named him. And they said he was constantly aware of who were good leaders and who wasn't. And they said they went on this conference and there was a big queue for the lift, or the elevator as they call it in America. And so she and her colleague decided to walk down the stairs instead of waiting for the lift. And when they got to the reception, this big famous leader said to them, "Yes, great. Leaders always take the stairs. They never take the lift." And it was this sort of idea of always looking for who's the best, who's got it, who's the number one, who's the A person here. So I think those models of leadership haven't helped us at all. There is a place for some of that heroism, actually, but sometimes it goes really off the rails. The models of leadership I really like, and I think do apply to us. And the reason they apply to us is because they match perfectly biblical notions of leadership. So they match things like servanthood. They match things like the body of Christ being diverse and everybody having different contributions to make that shouldn't be evaluated or compared to one another. They match Jesus's ideas of power in terms of, we don't lord it over people and we put the most vulnerable and the weakest in the centre. And there's sort of two models of leadership like that I really love. One very, very famous would be sort of Greenleaf's models of servant leadership, which is very kind of written first in the 90s, but sort of grew into prominence later on, in which he puts service and care right at the very centre of what it means to be a leader. And undoubtedly, you can see actually he's just really quoting Jesus. So he never does that, but you know that he's where he's got this stuff from. The other model that I really love is a less known model, but I think it will become bigger as time goes on, by a guy called Kim Cameron. And Kim Cameron is one of the originators of a field of study called positive organizational scholarship, which is the study of what makes organizations really good places. Yes, high performing, but also wonderful places to work as well. And Kim Cameron really sort of challenged a view of leadership that I hear talked about a lot in church. So I do hear some leaders going, "I don't want power, I want influence." And we all know what that means. Influence is just a euphemism for power. They're really saying, I actually want power, but I'm not going to call it that. And Kim Cameron, that was sort of quite popular in the sort of 90s, early noughties. And Kim Cameron challenged that and said, actually, talking about leadership as influence doesn't work. Because in the end, if you want influence and somebody else wants influence, it always ends in conflict, ends up in a power struggle anyway. And so he came up with this really beautiful idea of leaders as energizers. And one of the studies he did was he took a huge organization of thousands of people and he got everybody in the organization to list all the people they spent time with. And then they had to rate them all from +7 to -7. +7 was highly energizing. You spend time with this person and you're out the door, excited, glad to be there, wonderful. -7 is you spend time with this person and you lose the will to live as a result of having, completely de-energizing. And he then puts all this into social networking software. And what happens is when you do that is that the leaders pop out of the system. You see that these are the people who are pumping positive energy into the system. Quite often their names aren't above the door. So that this might not be the CEO, it might not be one of the managers, it might be someone who reports to them, might be someone who leads a team. Sometimes it's even people, who are right at the bottom of the sort of organizational triangle. So they can be anywhere in the organization, but they are leading. And what's fascinating is that if you have an organization with that kind of positive kind of energy in it, two things are true of it. Firstly, you tend to find that those people who are leading through character. So they are bringing their best to the workplace. They're bringing their humility, their integrity, their persistence, their creativity, their wisdom, so on and so forth. That's what they're doing, and that's what energizes everybody else around them, because they are energized, because they're bringing what's best in them to it. And then the other end of it is, once that positive culture is created, it leads to all kinds of really, really concrete outcomes that are super surprising. So over time, it means fewer sick days. When people are sick, they're less likely to be ill, less conflict. People live longer after retiring from those kind of organisations. They're more innovative. They're more likely to volunteer to do stuff. So on and so forth. So you get this sense of a really, really positive environment. And right at the heart of it are people who bring what is most beautiful in them to their workplace. And the moment they do that, functionally, they end up leading. And that's the kind of model for me that really fits beautifully with sort of biblical understandings of leadership, because it's about serving by bringing your best. And it also means there is no one right way to lead. So many of us have sort of internalized a sort of inappropriate role model of what it means to lead, and we think that's being a leader, and I'm not that, so I'm obviously not leading. Whereas this model would truly have a sort of body of Christ view. Yeah, maybe you're a hand, maybe you're a foot, maybe you're an eye. To change the metaphor, my favoured metaphor is the one that says we're not building a patio, we're building a mosaic, a place where nobody is... nobody's replaceable. Basically, we're all indispensable because we all bring something completely different, and our leaders tend to be those people who bring that in an energetic and beautiful way that inspires the people around them.
I wonder if you could just tease apart for me the difference between being energizing and the sort of classic understanding of what charisma is. And I think the reason I'm asking is because I think one of the challenges I've come across in church leadership is that people are expecting quite a narrow type of person to be called as a leader. And that tends to be quite an extrovert, quite loud, quite classically charismatic sort of personality. And I think a lot of people hearing the word energizing, that's where they might jump to, because that narrative has underlay so much of our leadership culture for so long. So I wonder if you can, because I think from what you're saying, that isn't the same thing, but I'm interested in where the nuance is.
I think that's a great question, Kate. So let me take the extroversion piece first, and then we'll talk about charisma. Because the interesting thing is that an energizing leader doesn't have to be an extroverted leader. So the interesting thing about this is that there's an example of somebody who I worked with for about 20 years. She's probably one of the shyest, most introverted people I've ever met, actually. But she was my mentor for a while. And I never spent time with her without coming away feeling absolutely inspired to do my best work. But she's not particular. She doesn't attract attention to herself. She's not particularly passionate. She's very thoughtful and quiet. Doesn't really even like presenting to people. And what was fascinating is I was presenting this research to a group of people that she happened to be in. And afterwards, she came up to me and she said, that stuff about energizing leadership, that's really lovely, but I just feel that I really failed to do that. It's just not me. And I won't name her because she would hate the fact that I'd name her, but I said to her, are you mad? I basically said, are you mad? You're literally the example I've been using of this for the last 10 years. It's you I've been talking about, because it's not about extroversion. It's about, do you bring what's really, really good in you to the table? And does that really help and inspire other people? So she's quite easy to be overlooked as a person. But if you pay attention and you listen to her and you give her the authority she deserves, she's incredibly inspiring and brilliant, and she inspired me. So firstly, we can be very quiet, very subdued, and still bring that, and that can still be energizing to other people. Now, the charisma piece is really, really interesting, because charisma doesn't really belong to an individual. Ultimately, charisma is something that happens between an individual and what a group of people want from that individual. The sort of transformation of the world that they require. And this does speak to some of the high-profile sort of falls from grace we've had in leaders here in the UK and over in the US in recent years, because very often they've been leaders who implicitly or explicitly have sort of promised a revival or a return of success to the church. They come at a particular point in history where church feels a bit on the back foot, and it sort of seems obvious that really in the West, if things carry on as they are, we're heading towards being a sort of minority religion, if anything, as time goes on. And therefore, in that cusp where it just looked like we might recapture the cultural high ground again, I think there was this moment when many very, very charismatic leaders stood up, and we wanted to believe them and trust in them and go with them, because it seemed like they would lead us back to the promised land that we were starting to feel exiled from. And I mean, yeah, I hate to bring in Hitler in any conversation, but in a sense, that's what happened in Hitler's Germany, is that he came with this promise of, yeah, we feel absolutely oppressed and shut down and all those kind of things, but I will lead us back to greatness, and that's where we're heading. And in the process of that deal, we are prepared to put up with all kinds of abuse, enslavement, coercion, control, because of the outcome we feel it's going to lead to. And so we sort of ignore the process, we ignore the means, because we think, I just want to get to the ends of this. And sometimes that's what you get with charismatic leaders. They're exciting, they're thrilling, they make us believe things that seemed impossible, and sometimes they do pull it off because they motivate people to do that. They knock down walls, they're courageous, but they can also really lead us up the garden path, particularly if they have a sort of view that in church leadership, for example, very often charismatic church leaders kind of subtly believe that their particular church is the center of the kingdom of heaven, that this really is the middle of everything that God is doing. And, we all know examples of some churches where they literally wrote themselves a history that went on for hours that put them at the center of everything that God was doing in the world. And later it was sort of debunked as all, concealing the bad stuff and amplifying some of the good stuff.
Yeah.
We hope you're enjoying this conversation on healthy leadership. If you're interested in more content like this, why not subscribe to My Spring Harvest Plus for access to over 12,000 talks from a range of speakers to help you develop as a leader and grow in your faith. There's thousands of talks from previous years at Spring Harvest alongside loads of other Christian events. You can try before you subscribe and find out more at myspringharvestplus.org.
Roger, I wonder whether we can dig into an element of that a little bit more. You talked about the things that we might be prepared to put up with in our pursuit of the charismatic leader, or any leader possibly. The danger, I guess, is that we see too many cases where people have, as you say, put up with things to their own detriment, to the detriment of the group, the community, the congregation, whatever the context is. And those people then get to a point where they are left thinking, hang on a minute, we've bought into this for so long. Now we are seeing damage to ourselves. We are seeing damage to others. We're beginning to realise that we've actually been part of sustaining a toxic environment through what has become toxic leadership. Can you talk a little bit about that? Because I think it's so relevant for us in our times today.
Yeah, it's so huge, isn't it? And I have to say that I often sort of feel a bit sorry for those people when, particularly if they feel very repentant and they feel guilty about it, and they're left reflecting on, how is it that we allowed, we could see that this was bad, and how was it that we allowed it to go on? So I think, firstly, the thing you must have heard a lot in your work, Justin, in safeguarding in churches, is that what I hear a lot from people who feel they've been abused on some level in a spiritual context is that they will say things like, yeah, but look at the fruit of it. I felt that if I stood up and spoke out, I was destroying the work of God. Yeah, I could see all the bad stuff. I knew it wasn't good, but I felt that if I destroyed this system or took down this leader, then the people who were becoming Christians, or the way in which the church was planting and growing, would all be destroyed. And who am I to do that? So I think that's part of it. I think the other thing that happens in those contexts is that part of leadership is a sort of social identification process. So if you have a very highly charismatic leader, you sort of identify with their view of the world and you share it with them. And therefore, just as they are saying, basically, yeah, if we're going to make an omelette, we're going to have to break a few eggs, you end up weirdly sort of thinking the same thing. We're heading towards this glorious outcome. And if along the way a few people get hurt or damaged, or, you know, as long as it isn't too much, we're constantly sort of doing, there are payoffs for this. The other thing we're usually ignoring is who falls out of the system, because the moment you disagree with a leader like that, there's usually quite a strong immune system in organizations like that identify you then as a foreign body and slowly push you out to the sort of edges of it. And you know what? Sometimes that's not verbal. So sometimes you're not even told that's what's happening to you. You just know that suddenly this system doesn't seem to be welcoming you anymore. You're not getting the place at the table. You're not on ministry staff, you know, etc. All these kind of things go on. And it's enormously painful to be in that situation, because it means that if you're at the center of the thing, you're looking at those people who've slowly fell away to the edges, and you're thinking, I don't want to be that person, you know, so I need to stay as close to the center of this thing as I can, even if that means it's painful. Let me just say something as well to people who find themselves in that situation where you've been pushed to the edges, because very often, to begin with, we're sort of filled with the idea that the leadership is wrong. So to begin with, we're enraged and we feel it's an injustice and we feel it's unfair. And it's absolutely right in a sense to begin with to feel like that. I've been in that situation myself, but I found that the healing for me only came at the point when I got beyond making that system wrong and started to reflect on what was it in me that made me part of that system in the first place. What did I sign up to? And if I'm honest, for me, and I won't speak for anybody else on this, for me, I had the same egotism, ambition, sense of, you could even call it narcissism or desire to be special that the leader had too, and that's what had tied me to them. And the pain of being pushed to the edges was the death of that sense in me that I was going to be that person. And weirdly, getting to the edges of an organization like that is probably one of the best moments of your life, when God can break in and meet you, bring healing, bring transformation, all those kind of things in a way that you can't when you're at the center of it. Because what a charismatic leader will do is they often inveigle themselves into your image of God. So sometimes I sometimes couldn't separate the leader who was so charismatic from my image of what God was like. And it was only really in stepping away that I could begin to sort it out. And I while I was in the midst of all that, I came to a quote that said something like, if you want to follow God, the first thing you have to do is remove from your path all those who have pretended to be God. And I think that's part of what charismatic leaders do to us. They sort of accidentally get tied up in our representation of God, and it's really hard to disentangle them. And that's why it's so hard for us to step away or really see the damage that they're doing.
Yeah. Thanks, Roger. That's so insightful. And it strikes me that in healthy contexts, we ought to be creating the opportunities for dialogue, for, as Kate was reflecting earlier, challenge that's constructive, that's positive, that is infused with a sense of humility that says, do you know what? I may be your leader, but I am going to get things wrong. I do not have all the answers. I need all of you around me to, for us all to get on this journey, because we don't want to leave people behind. We don't want casualties strewn along the pathway. Are there some key character strengths in leaders that we might be looking for that would help to create those healthy environments that avoid some of the stuff that you just described?
Let me just go with two of them to begin with, because it also speaks to the tension of leadership. Because I think many really good leaders are torn between, if you like, two character strengths. One of them is the persistence that says, I have a vision, I have a call, there's something to accomplish here, we have to push into it. That's one thing. And the other bit is the humility that says, but that doesn't make me inherently better than anybody else. I need to listen. I need to take in feedback. I need to be based in the reality of who I am and who this system is, so that I don't abuse everybody or live in a delusion. And my experience is that some leaders who end up perhaps creating unhealthy environments, let's call it that, have started in a situation that required enormous persistence from them. So they absolutely had to push and push and push and push. And lots of people said they couldn't do it, and they had to prove that they could. And then what happens when they have succeeded down the line is people come to them with tweaks or ways things could be better, or some complaints or ways in which the environment is unhealthy. And instead of them turning on some humility and going, let's listen to that because it will improve things, they instead default back to their persistence, which is, the thing that's got me here is ignoring criticism and pushing and going hard. So I think that's one of the things that sometimes happens. And particularly in some churches, that's why it makes it really, really hard for some leaders to even say the word retirement, or to bench themselves, or to step back, because it goes against absolutely, totally everything that they've developed in order to maintain their ministry. So that's sort of just to speak a bit more sympathetically about that side of things. But then the thing that really keeps us consistent. So one of my main areas of research has been on humility in leaders, and looked at that in lots of different contexts, and looked also at whether we like our leaders to be humble. Actually, we are a bit ambivalent about whether we want a humble leader or not. So we have to say that as well. So if our leaders aren't humble, they're actually responding to what a lot of people want from them. They want a pushy leader who seems to know everything, until they see the disadvantages of that. But what we know about humble leaders is that if a leader is humble, they keep learning all the time. They have this idea that they've got, nothing left to prove, but a lot still to learn. So they're constantly taking in information, which means they don't derail, in midlife, because they're adapting themselves all the time and changing. They don't offend quite so many people because they're willing to listen. They accept that not everybody will be with them. Their church is not the center of God's purposes on earth, which means that if it doesn't suit some people, they can be blessed and let go. And, head out, let's bless you, you do your thing. It's not what we're doing, let's do something different. The interesting thing, if you compare humility to, so what you might say the opposite, arrogance, is that there's a difference in how a sort of narcissistic person or an arrogant person versus a humble person processes information. So me and some of my colleagues did some research on this, and we tried to find the most arrogant people on campus, the most narcissistic people. Who did we find? Correct, drama students. So we basically went to the drama department and put them all through a sort of test of narcissism. And actually what we found is that it was normally distributed. Yes, there were some pretty grandiose narcissistic people there, but most people were just averagely that way, which is what most people are. And we did a sort of information test with them where they had sort of words fired at them. Some of them were positive, beautiful, successful, things like that. Some of them were negative, failure, worthless, unloved, ugly. And some of them were just sort of neutral words. And what we found was that the higher in narcissism somebody was, the faster their reaction time was in filing away negative words. In other words, it's like they didn't want them to hit their radar at all. It was like didn't want them to get anywhere near them. Their defenses were super fast in sorting those things away. And that's what you find with some leaders. It's not really it's based in childhood, their conditioning, the sort of coping strategies they've developed to sort of deal with the role that they're in. But some leaders have that working really, really strongly. And you notice that if you even vaguely get close to anything negative, they have really quick responses to file it away in all kinds of different ways. And the thing is, they've been doing that for decades. And so you or I, who don't function in that way, we are up against a master. When we encounter people like that, we're not going to get very far. The other thing some of those leaders do as well, and I notice this in a lot of sort of difficult church contexts, is sometimes they will talk a lot or they'll dominate the conversational space, which means that everybody around them is sort of waiting to have a conversation that they've never been able to have. So they never ask the questions that allow honest feedback to come. People are sort of looking at very, very small signs of self-awareness in them that means things might be changing, and hang on a long time on these sort of shreds and possibilities that the conversation they really want to have, the things they really want to say, will be accepted. And all the time that conversation isn't being had, we feel like we are carrying assumptions about the system, the leader, other people around, that we've never been able to voice, that are obvious to us. But one day when we finally explode or give up, or the leader behaves as if, why has no one ever told me this? You've been in this church 20 years and you've never said it. And the fact is, people have thought that all the time. And it was a bit mild, or it was, wasn't a particularly devastating piece of critique they had. But because they went for so long without being able to say it, eventually it comes out in rage. And the longer we go without having that conversation, the more complicit we feel in the environment that we're in.
That definitely triggers lots of questions in my mind, but particularly, our focus in this podcast, all these conversations we're having, is to think about, particularly coming out of a recent season where there have been some cases where some very serious leadership abuses have come into the light, where we're asking some of the big questions about what it looks like in this next season to model healthier leadership, to bring change, but also to respond to something that it feels like the Lord is doing in our very human leadership of this amazing, beautiful thing that is the church. And I guess there's two key questions, Roger, that I'm pondering listening to you talk. And the first one is about the status quo. So if you've got a lot of these very powerful cultures, the sort of intersection of powerful charismatic leaders, but also, as you say, followers who actually really want what those people deliver. They may even have selected them for that reason. It's a very self-perpetuating culture. I had down to ask you today, what do you do when there's someone who has no self-awareness? But actually hearing you talk, I'm thinking maybe it's not self-awareness. Maybe it is, as you say, this incredibly well-crafted defense against challenge. Where you have those powerful cultures, can they be challenged? Can they change? I've heard some amazing people who have stayed in those cultures because they can see that something needs to change. And I'm interested to, that's my first question. I'm going to let you answer it, then I'm going to ask the second. But so can we change these cultures, or is it actually more about just letting them be what they are, because that is just what they are, and in the meantime trying to build a new house next to them that's better? Does that make sense?
I think it's certainly easier to start a new culture than it is to alter one that's very strongly established. And then the other thing you will find is that, as I've mentioned, because these systems have these really strong immune systems, I mean, you must have heard these stories about younger leaders who take over from very powerful, charismatic leaders, and all the abuse they take in the process of doing that. The number of sort of leaders who've been in succession I've met who feel really, really angry about the slot in the system that they've been offered, which means they have to be a cross between, Jesus and Elijah, or, something really, really powerful and great. And if they're not that, then they suffer all kinds of abuse because the system is trying to shape them into the whole of what the previous leader was. And it takes enormous strength, enormous sort of resilience to do that. I do know leaders who've done that in the succession piece. They've done a really, really good job of not making the previous leader wrong, while at the same time leading in a different, more gentle, still passionate, still visionary way, but doesn't perpetuate the kind of things that have gone on. It's really difficult. And if you are a leader in that situation, you just have to be ready for the fact that you are going to endure the projections of a congregation that just want you to be the last guy who walked out. The other thing I would say is that, sadly, as someone who works as a psychologist, psychotherapist, I've come to this sort of slightly radical point of view, and you can tell me if you agree with me on this, but I actually don't think we can force anyone into self-awareness or self-knowledge. I think we can provide the context, we can challenge them, but we can never actually make them take that step of being aware of who they are. And the more I've thought about the ministry of Jesus, the more I've thought that Jesus probably thought the same thing too, in terms of, yes, he challenges the Pharisees, but can't convince them all to see the way they are. And then even when people are healed and transformed, Jesus has this strange thing where he says, it's your faith that made you well, which is really confusing because it sounds a bit new agey, really. But I kind of have this idea that what Jesus is saying it's our transparency to him, our willingness to be open, our willingness to see the world and rely upon the reality of the way things are in the way that he saw it is where our transformation lies. But the reason he says it's your faith is that Jesus knows that on some level what those people have done is cooperate with the movement of the Holy Spirit within them that leads them to that place. And if they didn't cooperate in that way, they wouldn't be able to get to that place of change and transformation. So I have to say there are some churches where I've sat in them thinking this is going to change, and in the end I've actually come to the conclusion it's actually not. The evidence is, so you know, if you've had a church leader who, you have some church leaders where there's like 20, there's maybe a lineage of about 20 people who've slowly all gone out the door one by one. One minute they're the golden boy, next minute they're gone, and that repeats over and over and over and over and over again. And what I came to realize is that all those people were carrying a really important message from God to that leader. This is where you're getting it wrong. This is what you need to improve on. This is where things would work better. And as they're all pushed out the door, that leader is deciding, they're not a Christian, but they're deciding that there's some element of what God would like them to become that they're rejecting and refusing to become. And that's why you see some of those sort of charismatic leaders, as they head towards retirement or towards sort of getting to the point where they're too tired to do the job they used to do, you quite often see this sort of sense of embitterment falls on them, and this sense of, I've been screwed over, no one appreciates me, etc., etc. Whereas I actually think the real journey of the spiritual life is to get to a generative phase. I mean, I'm turning 50 next year. I feel like I'm starting to get there, which is basically that thing where you say, do you know what? This isn't about me anymore. This is just about what I leave behind, what good things I give to other people. And I think that really should be the journey of our spiritual lives and the journey of leadership, which says, do you know what? This was never about me. It was never about this thing. It's about what goodness of God I can convey to other people while I still have the opportunity to do so.
Yeah, that's so interesting. And it feels like perhaps holding on to a hope that you can change something from within. I think maybe there's some people here listening now who are wanting to press pause and just ponder that, because I think there are some very tough questions there about when do you stop? When do you actually just need to walk away and say, I cannot change this? And the longer I stay, the more I continue to be part of something that is dysfunctional, that is unhealthy. And I think it's really tough. I mean, you've reflected, Roger, how hard it is to leave. I would also reflect that. It's not easy to walk away when you had hoped for something better growing. I know that's still not my second question, so let me ask it and then I can let you talk. I mean, my second question then is, I just feel like in so many conversations I'm having at the moment, there are people who are recognizing something that I also would sense spiritually, which is that the Lord is raising people who are modeling something really different from perhaps that season that you talk about where maybe in human terms we were self-selecting a very specific kind of leader, but also maybe there were some amazing steps forward being taken in kingdom terms that have changed and transformed the way that we do church. We've got to see it with both sides. But I would love to hear your advice for those people. I read an article where you referred to them as the outliers, which I think if you've been pushed to the edge of one of those very powerful cultures, you do feel like that, an outlier. Obviously, as a female leader, I think very often the models of leadership that women bring are very different to that. So I think a lot of women would find themselves there. But I also speak to some amazing guys who are clearly called as leaders in this season, but literally day to day, I have conversations with them and they are wrestling with, should I be doing this? I'm not the right person. I don't match the models. I can't fight my way through a culture that overlooks me all the time. I don't know what it looks like to be successful as a leader in this culture, being the sort of person I am. Give us some advice for those outlier leaders.
So just before I get to that, Kate, can I just say something about the people who are hanging in hoping that things will change? Because there's just one
Please
final
do.
thing. So if you find yourself in that situation, and this is quite a tough word, I have to say, you should reflect on how grandiose you are being by thinking that you can change that system. You should really, really think about. So you know how there's this sort of stereotype of how many women are attracted to bad guys who are not good news, and the reason they're attracted to them is because secretly they really believe that they will change them. They'll be the one who wins that person over. Are you being that person to your church? It's really worth thinking about that, about if God has called you to hang in there and be a good influence and to sow seed and pick up pieces, great, I'm not complaining about that. But if you really honestly think that you can change that system, you should reflect on it really deeply, on how much of that is your own grandiosity and how much of it really is the calling of God.
That is such a powerful challenge, Roger. Thank you. I mean, I'm just feeling for the people who paused already to ponder and have now pressed play, heard that, and now have had to pause it again and go away for another hour to think about it. Because that's how I feel.
Yeah.
Such a good challenge.
Yeah. Because, and let me just add, just to soften the challenge slightly, what we are responsible for is how we behave and what we bring and what we contribute to the system. How godly are we being? How much of Jesus do we bring? We're not responsible for how much of that really catches light and creates the outcomes we'd like to see. We just can't control that bit. And that's why sort of Jesus's life, crucifixion and resurrection are all important elements of it, because there is a sense on one level in which Jesus failed, to influence and change the world in the way he wanted to, but he changed it in a radically more powerfully different way. And so it's worth just thinking about that. Should we get on to the other question then? Do you know what, Kate? I'm absolutely thrilled by some of the leaders that I see coming through, even sort of leaders sort of heading into my age in their 30s and 40s. There's a sort of group of guys that I go on retreat with every now and then. There's sort of 10 of them, and they are incredibly thoughtful, passionate for Jesus people, deeply humble. And I look at them, and I look at some of the women that I see coming through who are leading in church. I look at some of the leaders I know here in my own church, and some of the leadership that's going on across the city that I live in terms of people working together and preferring one another. And I just think it's absolutely wonderful. So here's my sort of advice for it, is that in the end, we all want to be like Jesus. I know this sounds so fatuous to say. And when Jesus gets to the end of the Sermon on the Mount, he has three sort of analogies that he uses to try and get us to think about what that means. And the first one is one about roads, where you've got the super mega highway that leads to death and destruction. Popular, easy, shortcut. Loads of people do it. And then you have this way that is narrow and steep and hard and difficult to enter. And he says that's what's following me is. So it's not the preferred route. It's, you might feel that you've fallen into obscurity, or that you're sort of going the wrong way. But basically, if it's Jesus, it's all you have. I keep thinking of that passage in the Gospels where Jesus says, are you guys going to leave me now? And they respond, but you've got the words of eternal life. Where else are we going to go? And I think that's what we have to turn to. Second thing is fruit. Be really, really aware of what fruit is being produced in your life. And I don't mean sort of egotistically spotting how great you are. I mean that if you are following Jesus prayerfully on a day-by-day, practicing the presence of God kind of way, You know if you're less lustful than you used to be, less envious than you used to be, less lazy than you used to be, less rageful than you used to be. In a sense, a lot of that fruit to begin with, although, it is humility and it's love and it's gratitude and it's joy and it's peace and it's all that wonderful stuff. To begin with, we notice it because things that used to be there have gone missing. We get to the point where we used to lose our rag, and we're like, hang on a sec, that rage isn't there anymore. Where's it gone? And somehow the Holy Spirit's transformed something in us. So pay attention to that. And keep in mind that in the Sermon on the Mount, when Jesus uses that analogy, he's basically saying a good tree produces good fruit. A good tree cannot produce bad fruit. So if there's bad fruit appearing in your life or in your church, it's because somewhere at the roots of it, something isn't quite right. And no one will want to acknowledge that. Very few people want to see that. But just clock it, and be aware that that isn't something you want to cooperate with. Third analogy Jesus uses is the difference between the house on the rock and the house on the sand. And if we're not building our lives on following Jesus, we are building on sand. We're building something completely unsustainable that will fall apart. And as we know with some of the leaders that have fallen, they've fallen after they've died. They died, and then suddenly all this nonsense and awful things about them comes out afterwards. It's happened multiple times. So we might get through our whole life and kind of conceal the fact that we've built something on something that's a bit shifty and a bit shaky. And feel like we've got away with it. But actually the reality is Jesus is saying, I am the reality. The deepest reality of all is your connection and your contact with God. And that's what you build on. Wherever that seems to be greater, that's good. Wherever that seems to be lesser, that's where you want to change things a little bit. So talking to the leaders that we're talking about, Kate, is I would say this is... if you're looking at something and it doesn't look quite right to you, you're probably right about it. But don't spend all your time complaining about how that's wrong. Use that as something to swing you away from it in repentance, in turning, and back to following Jesus to the kingdom of God. And so that's the sort of weird thing about self-awareness. So I said we can't make other people self-aware, but the weird thing is that people who lack self-awareness are brilliant stimulators of self-awareness in us. That's what they are to us as a gift. I don't like what this person does. They don't seem to want to hear my view of it. But I go home and I sit in my chair, or I spend time in prayer, or I fellowship with other people and talk it over. And in the process, I discover a little bit about who I am, and a bit more of my ego, and a bit more of my flesh, and a bit more of some of my conditioning that isn't that healthy dies every time I do that. And therefore, being in a context that doesn't recognize you is really painful. And I've been in multiple of them myself. And I know it's much worse for other people than it has been for me. But I would say that sometimes that's a really, really good context to shape us. And in time, anything that's good in us, anything that's real, cannot be threatened. It can't be taken away. It will remain like rock forever. Anything that's delusional, reactive, based on making others wrong, won't last, will disappear.
Love that. I wonder whether we could talk for a long time, couldn't we? So much for us to dig into, but I wonder, we have 3 questions, Kate, don't we, that we are going to be asking all our guests. And I'm going to kick off with the first one of those, and it might be the most difficult of the 3. So as we've been talking about all of this, what do you think, Roger, is the one thing that needs to change in our church cultures that will have the greatest impact?
It's a great question. The thing, in my view, that would change everything, and who am I to say? But I would view this is, I think that most churches should just adopt a framework that says we are here to be with Jesus and be like Jesus, and anything that we do that doesn't serve those aims should be ditched. That's kind of the change I would implement if I had a choice.
Yeah.
Fantastic.
That's fantastic, isn't it?
Such an interesting one to ponder the outworkings of that. Second question then, on a more personal level, to the leaders, to us as leaders, to the leaders who are listening? Is there a practice or a rhythm of life, something that you think that is essential for leaders as part of this staying on that narrow path that you've described so beautifully in this season, to stay healthy in our leadership for ourselves, but also for those that we lead?
I'll tell you what my practice is that sort of makes a big difference to me. It might not be for everybody, but if anyone wants to pick it up and use it, it is so alongside sort of prayerfulness and knowing scripture and meditation and fellowship and all the usual things that God has put into this world to help us be more like him. The thing that really makes a difference to me is daily journaling. So I watch myself very, very closely, and I journal every single day about trying to make sense of who Jesus is and what he's about and what he's doing in my life. And that allows me to observe both what God is doing in me, but also more often where I'm failing to live up to that, where I've missed it. And for me, that's a practice of deep grace. That as I journal, I'm pausing a lot. I'm allowing the presence of God to meet me. I'm sitting in his kindness and his loving attentiveness to me. And when you look at your own sinfulness, let's say, in that context, with God looking with you, it doesn't feel so scary, and it is sort of transformed as you identify it and see it and go, oh, I hadn't noticed that. Okay, here we go. So for me, that prayer, it's funny we've talked about self-awareness. That process of self-awareness or self-knowledge, for me, it is the route to being more like Jesus, like knowing those things about us. So I would call it, just as we have Lectio Divina, I would call that Scriptio Divina, which is very often taking a sacred text or maybe a spiritual classic, and I'm taking a few lines from it and just writing about where it hits me, what I make of it, where I'd like to integrate it into my life, and really following quite often it just feels like I'm working with God as I do it, just following wherever the thought seems to take me as I do it. And I do that a lot. So I'm doing that sort of get up quite early, and this morning I was probably doing it for 2 hours, trying to get my kids out of bed to go to school, trying to scribble down some thoughts as I'm doing it because I hadn't quite got finished. Marie Claire, my other half, is asking, what are you thinking about at the moment? Like, some really profound stuff at the moment, but I'm not quite ready to talk about it until I'm done. And so just sort of, it becomes something you share with other people as well and say, this is what's going on, and these are the things I'm seeing in myself, and these are the prayers that I'm praying for other people. So that would be my practice, is sort of daily journaling. And some people that seems to work for great, other people not so much. So if you want to pick that up, please do.
So good. Thanks, Roger. So the third of our closing questions, which I think we've probably touched on already to some degree, so I think we can probably all guess where you're going to go with this, but is there a Bible passage or a verse that comes to mind that you ponder and you think is most relevant to the things that we've been discussing today?
So I've mentioned some of those elements from Matthew chapter 7 in the Sermon on the Mount, but actually let me go somewhere else and add something else to it as well, because the passage I keep thinking about a lot is the famous wedding passage in 1 Corinthians 13, where Paul talks about if you speak in tongues, or you give your stuff to the poor, or you have loads of insightful knowledge and mysteries and all that kind of stuff, but don't have love, you are nothing. And the reason I keep thinking about that is because I often think the church thinks the opposite of that. The church almost seems to think, as long as I can speak in tongues, and as long as I do loads of great work, and as long as I'm really clever, and as long as we see incredible miracles happen and the church grow, if we're not that loving, does it really matter that much? I feel like we've almost rewritten that passage. And so I like that passage as a corrective to how, and I would have this tendency as well, how functional we can end up being when we're trying to lead or grow an organisation.
I love that challenge. Thank you so much, Roger. And that's just an example of what I think you do so beautifully, and which is so rare, and I'm very grateful for, but that sort of compassionate challenge to ask the questions, to point out some of the flaws, or, as you say, the sort of sinful nature that flows sometimes through our leadership, because we are all flawed, broken human beings just trying to do our best with this stuff. And I'm really grateful for your ability to ask those questions so well and with such grace and gentleness. So thank you. This is the beginning of a series of conversations all about healthy leadership, just thinking about some of the key foundations, some of the important issues that we're all facing in this time. And you've raised so much that I will be reflecting on, I think, throughout, and we'll be continuing to pray through. So thanks to everyone also who's been listening today. We really hope you found this conversation helpful. If it's got you thinking, if you want to follow and catch up with the future conversations in this series, do make sure you subscribe to the podcast. We have many more amazing people who, like Roger, will be speaking into this whole area, pressing into some of the key topics and tensions, which are an inescapable part of being called to this wonderful but complex thing that is church leadership. Just before everybody goes back to whatever your day is bringing to you today, let's just pause for a moment, and I'm just going to close us in prayer. And as I was preparing for this conversation today, the Lord really just brought me back again and again to the words of Hebrews 12, as we fix our eyes on Jesus, the pioneer and perfecter of our faith, the root and foundation of everything that we do. So Lord, we pray in this moment for all those you have called to leadership, for all those given positions of authority, responsibility and influence, for all those who cry out against systems or cultures that feel unjust, for all those trying to do something better, for all those striving and dreaming of the kingdom of heaven here on earth. And we pray, as Paul says, for those who need to throw off something that hinders. The original language there, talking about an inner wound that can still hold us back. We pray for those who have been healed, who have suffered because of some of these cultures, because of abusive leadership or the impact that power has had on them, the outliers who have felt overlooked and pushed to the edge. Lord, help us to throw off those things and the sin that so easily entangles, the things that are within us that could challenge us, limit us, and push us off your path in our leadership. And as Paul says, let us run with perseverance the race marked out for us. So I pray as we close for all those listening, Lord, your love surround us, your hope uphold us, and your grace and goodness sustain us always. In the name of Jesus. Amen.
Amen.